Kari is joining me now, and most of my listeners know that I have three kids, two daughters and a son. And Kari, I know you have written a lot about this topic. I love your podcast as well. And I want to talk today about finding joy and connection with our kids, because in all the chaos, sometimes that gets forgotten.
Right. And I think that, I really write for parents of teenagers right now, just because that's the season of life I'm in. And I don't know about your experience, but I think what happened with me, and that's pretty common with families, is that, your toddlers and babies, it's a pretty hard season of life. And then your kids get older, they're about 7 or 8, and you hit that sweet spot of parenting. And I remember in that season, I'd hear the things about teenagers, about hormones and moods. And I didn't really believe it because the kids were still affectionate. They loved being with me. It's just, you're like, this is great. And then about, 11 or 12, sometimes we feel our kids just pulling away a little bit or just acting a little different in their search for independence. And then as they enter the teenage years, it can really throw us for a loop as parents. And it's totally normal. But as parents, we're like, we miss that affection. We miss that connection that we had with our younger child. And I know what happened with me was I was trying to use the same strategies I used when they were little, and it just wasn't working. So I had to really, it was a journey for me, just finding new approaches to connect with my teenage girls and try to be part of their world at a time where, they were expanding their world and wanting to be with their friends, but also wanting some family connection too.
I can relate to that in so many ways, because toddlerhood is difficult. But after going through the teenage years, I would go back to changing diapers and having a toddler any day.
Right.
And we do find that it's a different season. We have a struggle in every season, but the teenage years, at least to me, it feels like the stakes are so much higher.
Yes, that's exactly it. And I was talking to somebody yesterday that, especially, I don't know why the birthdays are always the markers for me, but when my daughters turn 15, 16, 17, I have this 18 number in my head, and I'm thinking, I only have 2 more years with them here at home. I have 1 more year with them here at home. And you just feel like you have to cram everything in before they launch into the world. And I think as parents, we can really just focus so much on that and thinking of all the lessons we want to teach them before they leave, that we're really not making that emotional connection with them and just building that relationship that's going to be so important, not only during the teenage years, but also as they leave home.
Well, I'd like to get some tips from you. And with four daughters, and how many books have you written on this topic?
I've written 2 books for teen girls and a book for moms of teen girls, and then a new book for moms that will come out in April.
Oh, I can't wait. Okay, I want to hear more about that in just a moment, but let's go straight to tips. Let's get straight to that connection, that joy, how to get through it. Right. Take it away.
Right. The number one thing I've learned is that we can't take it personally. And we have to be a little bit prepared for rejection, and just know that I know my mistake with my teenagers is when they did start acting like teenagers or fitting the stereotype out there or having those moments or seasons, I would take it personally. And if they got moody, I would get moody back. And I was really making it about me. And then, one of the good things about doing the work that I do for teenage girls is that you just learn that they are struggling with so much internally that they're not sitting there thinking, how can I have a closer relationship with my mother or father? That's just not on their radar. They're not intentionally trying to be hurtful. And yes, we do have to teach them how to be respectful when we're having arguments or conflict. But, really, they're just juggling with their bodies are changing, their moods are changing. A psychologist once told me that the part of your brain that interprets your emotions is behind your emotions themselves. So I think that sometimes they're experiencing these big emotions and these big feelings, but they can't interpret them yet. Like, I'm angry and I don't know why, or I'm sad and I don't know why. So there's just so much inner turmoil. And then on top of that, social media, friendship issues, bullying, everything else that just our teenagers are dealing with today, they're wrestling with inside. And so I think so much what we see as parents is not really an effect of what we're doing, but basically with what they're struggling with. And so that really can lead to some conflict between parents and teenagers, because I made that mistake. She was being moody. I'm like, I'm going to put this kid in her place, like we're going to, I'm going to dig my heels in. I'm going to show her who's the boss here. But that approach maybe worked when they were younger, but as for teenagers, it really was just increasing the gulf between us. And we were just fighting all the time. And my oldest went to school one day. She was in 8th grade, and I just burst into tears. I'm just crying in my closet. And I was like, something's not right here, and I'm the adult in this relationship. And I told my husband, I'm really struggling with how to parent a teenager, but also love a teenager at the same time. And that really led me on this 5-year journey of like, okay, what does that look like? How can I still love them, but also parent them and try to correct those behaviors and attitudes that I don't like. And what I basically realized was that, if we want to have a voice in our teenagers' lives, we've got to have a relationship. Because as a friend of mine put it, as our kids get older, we go from a position of power to a position of influence as parents. But we're not going to have influence if they don't want to listen to us, if we don't have a relationship, if we're only trying to give them life lessons. They're smart enough to know who likes them, who sees the good in them. And so I think that we've got to remember that if they're not getting that from us at home, then they're going to find it elsewhere in the world. And they might find somebody else to be that influence in their life, or that primary voice in their life. So that's kind of the trick, is how to balance, like I said, parenting them, but also loving them and building that relationship.
That is so good. I love that, that we go from position of power to position of influence. And I don't know about you, but I think many people, our generation with teenage kids now, like I was just parented differently. And
Right.
I think, and I always thought, oh, I'm going to be a pretty strict parent. And then I turned out to not be as strict, but then I kind of go back to, oh no, I just need to be strict. And I, like you just said, that balance of, I want to love them, but I need to give them boundaries. I know they need boundaries, but I want them to have a relationship with me and not push me away. And it's just this, I don't know, we're just in a different place than our parents were. And I think a lot of that is what they're involved with. We didn't have social media. We didn't have the influence of that. We didn't have as much technology. We didn't have cell phones. We didn't have all of that, right?
Right. And you talked earlier about the stakes being higher. And I do think for parents today, and this is why it's so scary on our part, is that the stakes are higher if there's something going on with our teenagers that we don't know about, that there's so much that they can be lost in or involved in online that we have no idea. And so it really is important to have that relationship, maybe even more so than it was when we were growing up in the 80s or the 90s or the early 2000s, because there's a lot more, I guess there's a lot more trouble or just there's a lot more dangers that can be easily accessed, whether it's online or different places. And so it's really important for us as parents just to keep a pulse on their lives and just to kind of know them well enough to say, something's not right with her. She's not acting like herself, and to not take it personally, because a lot of times it's not about us. It's something that they're going through, and to really, just kind of, sometimes I just pray about it, pray before I speak, or just really think, what's a backdoor way I can have this conversation, or just really waiting for the right time to have a conversation. Mm-hmm. That was another mistake I made. I mean, sometimes I'm like, I've got 5 minutes here. We got to have this conversation, and it does not go over well because they're grumpy or hungry or not in the mood to talk, and it just falls flat. And so sometimes we've just got to know what conversations we want to have, but then just wait for the right opportunity to have it.
Tip number 1, timing is everything.
Yes.
And yes. I think that I've seen that even with my younger one, timing is everything. That you have to know. It's intuition too, as a parent.
Yes.
This feels like a good time, or they opened the door, so now I'm going to go through it. They're listening or they're engaged or whatever the case is.
Yes.
Let's talk about that balance of parenting versus friendship, because I am fortunate to have great friendship with my older daughter, who's 20, almost 21, and my 16-year-old daughter. But there are times when I have to step back and my husband and I say, okay, this is the parent moment, not the friendship moment. And that's hard because we want them to trust us as friends.
Right. I think that's so important. And I think that's a common struggle for people who are trying to be intentional parents in this generation. One quote I always go back to, it was made by a youth pastor here in our community, but he said, it was a parenting seminar I went to, and he said, we're not parenting for our 16-year-old to like us. We're parenting for our 40-year-old to respect us. Mm. And I just really keep that in mind, because I have so many friends who went through hard things as teenagers, and it might have been their parents' divorce. And so they'll say, when I was 16, I blamed my dad because, of whatever reason. But now that I'm 40 and I see the bigger picture, and I realize how much strength it took for them not to bad talk the other parent, or, they just see the situation differently because they're just smarter and their brain's in a different place. And so I think that's really important for us to remember as parents, that sometimes we're going to make decisions that they don't like, or that they don't understand, or that they might even fight us on. But that's why we can't be living for our child's approval, because, we have an adult brain and they don't yet. Their brain's not fully developed until what age is it, like 25. And so a lot of decisions we make, they're not going to understand. And I've even told my girls that before, like, I know you don't understand this now. I promise I'm making this decision out of love. I hope that one day you will understand it. But, I was talking to a woman yesterday. This is just an example. And she said she was pretty strict on video games when her boys were in high school. And of course, they fought her on it because their friends had a lot more hours online and all of that. But she goes, now that they're in college, they thank me because they've seen how a lot of their friends are addicted to video games, and a lot of them are not making their grades, or they're failing out of school because they're on their video games all day. And so they see it just from a different perspective, even just a few years later after high school. And so I think that's, as parents, we want to pick our battles, but there really are some lines we have to draw because, the way I look at it, if we're not giving them those boundaries, who will? If we're not being their mom or being their father, then who's going to play that role? Nobody else will.
So to take that step back in the heat of the moment when you're trying to decide parent or friend, and I'm going to think, what do I want them to think when they're 40? What do I want them to thank me for when they're 40? Because it's the heat of those moments when it's hard to be the parent, when you just want them to love you and get that approval. So let's talk about parenting mistakes. I know you've written a lot about this. I'll raise my hand. I've made a million of them. I still do to this day, but we all do the best we can. What can we learn from our mistakes, or what maybe mistakes can you prevent us from making?
Yes. It's funny. I had coffee with some young moms recently. They were just had babies in their laps, and they were so scared to make mistakes. And I remembered myself at that age. They're so scared to do something wrong. And I was like, I hate to tell you, but you're going to make lots of mistakes, and it's okay. But it really, God is good. He can bring good from any situation. He can restore a lot of bad situations. But, I've learned not to be so scared of my mistakes, because sometimes we're just doing the best that we can with what we know at the time. Yeah, probably the best example is the book that I've released last August. It's called Love Her Well, 10 Ways to Find Joy and Connection with Your Teenage Daughter. But I start that book, as you know, with I'm crying on the floor in my closet because, my daughter and I just argued again before school. I know that something is wrong. It was my pride getting in the way, but I didn't quite realize that yet. But I was writing books for teen girls at the time. And so I remember having that rock bottom breakdown moment, thinking, I don't want anybody to ever know about what's happening in my house right now. This is totally undermining any credibility I have as a writer for teenage girls. And my oldest daughter was only 13 at the time. But the fact that 5 years later, I took that story, and this is the opening story of a book that I'm not scared for people to read, just to be out there online or in published form. I think that's such a testament how God can use our mistakes to bring good from them and to help others, because that's the number one thing moms tell me about the book when they read it. I was crying on the first page. I relate to that story because that's where I am right now. And it gives them hope that might not be where they are 2 years from now or 5 years from now. So just really learning from our mistakes. And something else I think is really important is the importance of us apologizing to our children. And that was something I've learned. I always felt like, having 4 daughters, I had to be this perfect role model. And, I couldn't admit my mistakes because that would make me lose credibility. Well, that might work when they're little, but then as they get older, they know when you're making a mistake, or they know when you're the one that's wrong. So when you're not admitting that your mistake, then it's just increasing that gulf between you. So that really changed my relationship with my girls when I said, I should have handled that differently with you this morning. I lost my temper. I'm sorry. And talk about diffusing a situation. And I think also too that our girls are growing up in a world that they just see perfection all around them. They are scared to death to fail. And so as parents, we shouldn't be so scared of our failures. And we should really talk openly about it. Like, I failed to be a good friend today, or I failed to remember to pick you up on time, or I failed in this way. And just to make them, let them see our humanity in those small ways, so that they're not so ashamed of those human moments that they have. And they also can say, well, I failed here, but I'm going to work on this and try to do better.
Yeah. And following it up with that I'm going to work harder. I'm going to do better next time because I learned from that. So how do your girls feel about this? 4 girls, 1 in college, right? And how old is your youngest?
And my youngest is 11, sixth grade.
I have 11-year-old too. Mine's a son. Okay. So many of these things, by the way, I know you write for teenage girls, but a lot of it really does apply. 95% of it applies to boys as well.
I love hearing that.
I'm finding that. So how do your girls feel about you writing about teenage girls, especially when it comes to telling stories? Like, a million things pop up in my mind here on this podcast when I use my kids as examples, and then I have to step back and say, they might not want me to use them as examples. So I get approval for that. but I also want to make it very well known that I'm a mom like everyone else, going through the same things everyone else is going through.
Right. And that's a great question. And I really had to decide that early on when I started blogging 6 or 7 years ago. And, there've been several things that we've gone through, or I've gone through with my daughters, that I know this would make a great story. This would
Mhm.
probably go viral. It could get a lot of attention, but it would probably hurt my relationship with my
Mhm.
daughter. And I saw this early on with when the internet and social media came about. It basically was something like, all these kids that we're writing about today are going to be adults one day, and they're going to be able to write about us. Like one
When they
day the
get
tables,
approval.
they will be exactly. And so I'm like, if we're just writing whatever about them, they will be able to do the same thing about us one day. And so I really do try to just be very careful about what I share. And if it is a story that I think might embarrass them, I'll get approval. Most of the time they're okay with it. When just the stories that I ask to share. Occasionally there'll be something like, no, I do not want you to use that,
Mm.
and I won't. But the good thing about my work is that I wrote for teenage girls first. And so I did a lot of traveling and speaking to moms with that, and just having 4 daughters. I know a ton of moms from that. So I'm always getting material from so many different places.
Mhm.
Sometimes it's moms that I know, sometimes that's moms I meet on the road. And so I can really share a lot of stories without sharing our personal stories. And for the most part, when I'm writing for parents, I try to write more about like what I'm doing wrong or what I'm learning as a mother, rather than what my kids are doing wrong.
Mhm.
I try to make it more about me and my journey rather than focusing the spotlight on them. But you're right, it is tricky, and I have to be careful because I don't ever want to jeopardize my relationship with them.
You know what it leads to, though, for me, is the importance of friends and mentors and groups, girlfriends, whatever that might be. That we shouldn't go through these things alone, be it
Right.
a parenting issue or anything else. That being alone in those difficult times is really, really hard. And knowing that other people, like you said, you didn't want anybody to know in the beginning that you were in your closet crying, but
Mhm.
having someone there with you and walking you through that and feeling vulnerable enough to reach out to someone can be very powerful.
Yes, I agree 100%. I just think that we are meant to do life together, and we're not meant to struggle alone. And there's such beauty, and so much can happen when we do bring our struggles to light. And obviously, it has to be with the right people. And that's one thing I try to do with my books. I really encourage moms. I think the real work happens in a small group, when you're studying it with the people face to face. And I'm hoping that, the stories that you and I share, that maybe it's just a launching pad for other people to go, okay, I heard this on a podcast today, or I read this in a book, and now somebody shared this vulnerable story, and that might lead somebody else to share their story that relates to that. And it's really just a conversation starter that takes a conversation to a deeper direction than might
Yeah.
have obviously happened.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I really appreciate your expertise, and I want to get your book information and so on in just a moment. But I have a couple of questions I like to ask of people to learn a little bit more from them. And the first question I like to ask is, you're a busy mom, 4 kids, you're an author, you run your blog. How do you, or what tip would you have for productivity? Your favorite tool for productivity?
I would say my two favorite tools, it's hard to pick one, and this is something I think that just has come with age, is to expect a little bit less of myself, because you're right. I mean, even now with what I'm doing, there's so much more required of a writer than 6 years ago when my first book released, because now there's podcasts and social media on top of writing the book and doing speeches and things like that. And so I used to just try to do it all at one time. And now I'm like, no, I can do this many speaking events, or this week I'm going to focus on these articles, and I'm going to be I feel accomplished, even though I might be accomplishing a little bit less each day. I'm saving some energy for my family. And another thing is to really, like we talked about earlier, have seasons for things. And that has helped me just to kind of cut things off. And so an example is when my first book came out, I had all these speaking events, and I just booked whatever came my way. And I was also writing my second book. And I talked to one of my writer friends. I'm like, how in the world are you juggling both of these things? It's so hard. And she said, I have seasons. If I'm in a writing season, I'm not speaking. And if I'm in a speaking season, I'm not writing. And that was such common sense, but it was really enlightening to me. Like, oh, I never considered that as an option. And so with my second book, I learned to do that. I'm like, after the book launches, I'm not writing anything. I'm in a speaking season. I'm doing podcasts and all of that. And also knowing that I know that that's a busy season. That's 6 weeks after a book comes out. And so taking a break after that, I know a lot of writers that will do that because there's so much energy that goes into writing a book. And and launching it too, that you need that time to regroup and reset, and really leaving an open space for that.
Do you know what I love about that? I think everyone can apply that to their life. For instance,
Mm-hmm.
the first week of school is crazy. Everybody's trying to figure out their new routines, and or maybe it's the first month of school, but to give ourselves enough grace to
Yes.
say, this is going to be busy. I'm not doing coffee or lunches or anything until, for the first 2 weeks of school, but to like think about that ahead of time and give
Yes.
yourself that season to just settle in, let everybody get their ducks in order. And then, I had another podcast guest call that compartmentalizing. And I'm just going to
Yes.
have that compartment for now and this one for now. And I love that. I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
do more of that. Great,
Yes.
great
And I
advice.
did it when my daughter went. I knew my daughter, she was graduating last May. And so with my editor, so I told them, I want to get my resume, my manuscript to you, by the end of April, because I'm taking the whole month of May and June off just to kind of focus on getting her ready for college and enjoying the last of her senior year. And I was able to enjoy that month more because I wasn't trying to multitask too many things.
Yeah. And try to make everybody else happy.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Okay. And then my second question that I like to ask, and I'm really interested in this because I don't know when you started writing or your background, but when did you realize your purpose, or are you still figuring that out?
Oh, that's a good question. I think I'm still figuring that out. I would say probably my first sense of like, oh, wow, this is why I'm here was probably the day that my first daughter was born, just becoming a mom. I think that just instilled in me a sense of purpose like I'd never felt before. And little did I know I'd have three more daughters after that. And so I really just felt like that was my passion, my daughters. And then I also love to write. And it all kind of came together as I turned 40, and those paths just started crossing, and I started writing about teenage girls and raising girls, and it just led to some writing opportunities like releasing a book. So it definitely happened for me later in life, which I'm glad now, but it took a long time to get there.
I love hearing stories like that in your 40s that you figured that out. And a lot of us still are. I mean, I changed my career path completely and I'm loving it. And it's a hard thing for people, but to hear stories like yours and to use that as a launching pad to say I can still do something different. That's
Right.
great. Okay, where can people find you and learn more about you?
Okay. I'm on Instagram at Kari Kampakis. I'm on Facebook at Kari Kampakis Writer. I have a Twitter account, but I don't tweet that much. And then I have a website, karikampakis.com. And then my books can be found on Amazon and everywhere books are sold.
And I will link those books in the show notes. I'm really excited for the new one. And you said
Thank
that's
you.
coming out in the spring.
Yes, April 5th.
Terrific. Well, best of luck with that, Kari. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me. And I'll be following you and all that you do, and love to your girls as well.
Thank you, Natalie.